It was a beautiful day in the heart of a historic city. Tourists roamed the streets, excited to visit one of the oldest castles in the country. The sun shone brightly, making the stone walls of the castle glisten. Everywhere you looked, there were people taking pictures, smiling, and chatting as they enjoyed the sights. In the middle of all this, one royal guard stood still, his uniform sharp and immaculate. His job was to stand at attention in front of the castle, watching over the entrance with absolute focus. His expression was calm, but his mind was alert, as he knew that his role was not just about tradition. It was about maintaining the dignity of the royal family he served. The royal guard was young, no more than 22 or 23 years old. His posture was perfect, shoulders straight, eyes focused ahead. He had trained for months to be able to stay in one position for long hours without moving. It wasn't easy, but he understood the importance of his role. People admired him, taking pictures from all angles, amazed by his commitment. The crowd was a mix of curious tourists and families, some chatting excitedly, while others simply enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. Among the crowd, there was a woman who stood out. She was in her 40s, wearing expensive-looking clothes, and seemed to think that the world should revolve around her. Her name was Karen, and she had a reputation for expecting special treatment wherever she went. Today, she had decided to visit the castle, but she had no intention of waiting in line or following any rules. She wanted her picture taken with the royal guard, and she believed he should be happy to oblige. As she approached the guard, she smiled and raised her phone, ready for a selfie. She took a few steps closer, expecting the guard to break his stance and acknowledge her presence. But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, and his face showed no emotion. Karen felt a flicker of frustration. She was used to getting attention wherever she went, and this silence from the guard made her feel irritated. She took another step forward and raised her voice slightly. "Excuse me, aren't you going to move? I need a picture with you," she called out, hoping that the guard would respond. But the royal guard remained as still as ever, not reacting to her words or her presence. He was trained to stay focused and to ignore any distractions. His mission was clear: to stand in his position and show respect for the tradition he represented. Karen was growing impatient now, thinking that maybe he hadn't heard her. She took a few more steps, standing directly in front of him, blocking his view. "Hey, are you going to talk to me or not?" she demanded, her voice sharp and loud enough for a few people nearby to turn and look. The royal guard didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his posture unwavering. To anyone watching, it was clear that this was more than just a job for him. It was a matter of honor and duty. But Karen didn't understand that. She had only one thing on her mind: getting her picture and moving on with her day. However, the guard's refusal to respond seemed to only fuel her frustration. She was used to people bowing to her wishes, and today, she wasn't about to let a silly guard stand in her way. Karen's patience was starting to run out. She stood there for a moment, staring at the young royal guard, who hadn't moved an inch. His silence seemed to annoy her even more. She had never been ignored like this before. She was used to people jumping at the chance to help her or give her attention, no matter where she went. But this guard, standing at his post, wasn't giving in. Karen crossed her arms and tapped her foot, a clear sign that she was getting frustrated. "Why aren't you responding to me? Do you even know who I am?" she muttered under her breath, not expecting anyone to hear. But a few tourists nearby, who had noticed the interaction, turned their heads. They were curious about what was happening. The royal guard, however, still didn't flinch. His eyes remained straight ahead, and his posture stayed perfect. Karen's mind raced. She was used to being the center of attention, and this behavior from the guard didn't sit well with her. She took a step closer, practically standing directly in front of him now. She leaned forward slightly, her voice rising with irritation. "Hey, what's wrong with you? Are you too good to talk to me? I'm trying to take a picture here," she snapped, loud enough for the people around to hear. There was a slight edge to her voice, a tone that demanded respect. But again, the guard didn't react. He stayed absolutely still, unmoving, as if he hadn't heard a word she said. Karen wasn't used to people not giving her what she wanted, and her pride started to take over. She glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered, noticing that some of them were watching her with curious eyes. The guard's refusal to engage seemed to be drawing more attention to the situation. She wasn't about to let anyone think she was being ignored without reason, so she decided to raise the stakes. "Are you going to let me take my picture or not? I don't have all day for this nonsense," she shouted, making sure her voice carried. This time, her words were not just directed at the guard, but to everyone within earshot. She wanted the people around her to know she was in charge of this moment. As soon as she spoke, there was a noticeable shift in the crowd. Some of the tourists started to exchange looks, while others quietly shifted their stance, no longer focusing on the royal guard, but on Karen's loud demands. A few individuals even started to murmur to each other, some shaking their heads, clearly uncomfortable with her behavior. The young guard, still holding his position, gave no indication that he was paying any attention to Karen's outburst. His professionalism was clear to anyone who was watching. He wasn't rude, and he wasn't disrespectful. He was simply doing his job, remaining calm, and not letting the situation distract him. To him, staying still and silent was not just a requirement of his duty, it was a matter of pride. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. The more the guard ignored her, the more her frustration grew. She took another step closer, practically face to face with him now, and her voice grew louder. "You're embarrassing me in front of all these people," she exclaimed, completely losing her cool. The surrounding crowd, which had started as a passive group of tourists, was now slowly turning its attention to the interaction, waiting to see how it would unfold. Some people were already shaking their heads in disbelief, while others seemed to be growing uncomfortable with Karen's behavior. But the guard remained unmoved. The tension in the air grew thick as Karen stood directly in front of the royal guard, her frustration now boiling over. She had been ignored long enough, and she couldn't believe what was happening. The crowd, which had been casually enjoying the scene just moments ago, was now clearly divided. Some watched in silence, unsure of what to make of the situation, while others looked on with growing discomfort, sensing that things were starting to go too far. Karen, with her hands on her hips, took a deep breath and tried once more to get a reaction from the guard. She had tried speaking loudly, tried stepping closer, but nothing seemed to make him budge. The silence between them seemed to stretch on, and for a moment, Karen's thoughts raced. Why wasn't he responding? Why was he standing there like a statue, refusing to engage with her? Didn't he realize who she was? She couldn't understand it. In her mind, she told herself that maybe it was time to try a different approach. She took a few steps back and tried to collect herself, wiping her hands together as if preparing for something big. She even smiled, a fake smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and called out to the guard once again, but this time in a more sarcastic tone. "Oh, come on. Really? You can't even move for a second to take a picture with me? Are you too busy with your little role here?" Karen's voice rang out, and she looked around, hoping to get the crowd on her side. It seemed that the louder she spoke, the more attention she gained. People were starting to gather around, their eyes shifting between her and the unmoving guard. The camera flashes from a few tourists grew more frequent, some capturing the strange scene unfolding before them. Still, the royal guard didn't react. He stood as firm as ever, with his gaze fixed forward, and his body unmoving. He was still a symbol of calm and discipline, a beacon of tradition. His eyes may not have shown any emotion, but it was clear to those who were watching that his dedication to his duty was unshakable. His training had prepared him for situations like this. It didn't matter how loud or rude the woman was. His job was to remain still, and that was what he would do. Karen's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. She had never been so humiliated in her life. How dare he not even acknowledge her? Didn't he know that people like her deserved special treatment? She thought for a moment that maybe, just maybe, he would give in if she made a bigger scene. After all, wasn't that what worked on people? The louder you got, the more attention you attracted. But the guard didn't even flinch. As she looked around, the crowd's behavior started to shift. At first, it seemed like people were just observing the scene with mild curiosity. But now, some were beginning to murmur to each other. A couple of them shook their heads in disbelief at Karen's behavior. Others whispered among themselves, some even taking a side glance at the guard, admiring his unyielding focus. A few tourists, noticing how the guard was being treated, began to speak softly in support of him. "He's just doing his job," one person said, while another added, "He's not supposed to engage with anyone unless it's part of his duty." As more people spoke up, Karen could feel the weight of the crowd's attention shift. It was as if the tide had turned, and the support for the guard was beginning to build. Karen's expression faltered as she realized that the people around her were not siding with her. She had expected them to take her side, to join in her complaint. But instead, they were starting to side with the guard, respecting his quiet professionalism. The more the crowd spoke, the less control Karen felt over the situation. She had become the center of attention, but not in the way she had wanted. The sense of power she had expected to feel was slipping away, and with it, her confidence. Karen's irritation reached a boiling point. The realization that the crowd was no longer on her side hit her hard, and she could feel her grip on the situation slipping away. She had expected to have all eyes on her, to be the one in control, but instead, the attention was shifting toward the royal guard, who remained as still and focused as ever. His unwavering professionalism was now being respected by the crowd, and it only made Karen feel more isolated. The murmurs of support for the guard grew louder, with a few people even beginning to speak out openly. "He's just doing his job," one person said, their voice calm but firm. Another person nodded and added, "It's not his fault she doesn't understand what he's there for." Karen could feel the heat rising in her face as the voices around her began to echo the same sentiment. They were all on the guard's side, not hers. At first, Karen had tried to ignore the growing support for the guard, hoping that her own demands would overpower the murmurs. She took a deep breath and raised her voice even higher, trying to draw even more attention to herself. "I don't know why you all are siding with him," she shouted, her voice filled with frustration. "He's supposed to be here to serve us, not act like some statue." But the more she yelled, the more the crowd's reaction shifted. A few people even looked at her with pity, while others shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with her behavior. The tourists who had once been quietly observing the scene now exchanged glances, some of them whispering to each other. The guard, still unfazed, seemed almost to be unaware of the commotion around him, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Karen's anger flared as she realized that her plan to draw attention to herself was backfiring. Instead of getting the attention she so desperately sought, she was becoming the subject of the crowd's judgment. It felt like a punch to her pride. She had always been able to control any situation, to twist things in her favor. But not this time. This time, the guard's calm and steadfast demeanor was winning the crowd over, and Karen didn't know how to stop it. She took another deep breath, trying to regain some sense of control. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the crowd wasn't just watching. They were actively supporting the guard. A few of them even started to speak directly to her now, their words cutting through the noise of her anger. "He's just doing his duty," one man said, his voice steady but firm. "You can't just expect people to change what they're doing just for you." Karen blinked in disbelief. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly with frustration. She had always been able to charm or force people into doing what she wanted, but here she was, surrounded by people who seemed to think that the guard was in the right. How had it turned around so quickly? As the crowd continued to support the royal guard, Karen's grip on the situation loosened further. She realized she had no power here, not with the people, not with the guard. The fact that he remained silent, focused solely on his job, had made her look like the one who was out of place. And now, the people around her were beginning to realize the same thing. The realization hit Karen hard, and for a moment, she felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had expected respect, but she was getting none. In fact, she was getting something far worse. The cold truth that people didn't always have to cater to her demands. And as she stood there, unable to change the situation, she could feel the shift in the crowd. The support for the guard had only grown stronger, and Karen could sense that her time in the spotlight was rapidly coming to an end. As Karen stood there, feeling more and more embarrassed, the atmosphere around her changed. What had started as a quiet scene in front of the castle had turned into a clear standoff. People in the crowd were now openly talking about the situation, and more than a few were speaking in defense of the royal guard. Karen tried to focus, but the comments she was hearing were not the ones she expected. They weren't in her favor. "I don't know why she's acting like this," one woman whispered to her friend. "The guard's just doing his job. She should respect that." Karen's face turned red as she heard those words. She hadn't realized just how many people were watching. She thought they were all focused on her, but now she could see the way their eyes shifted from her to the guard, their faces reflecting a growing sense of discomfort with how she was behaving. The once crowded square had become a quiet, tense space, filled with soft murmurs and side glances. Karen tried to hold on to her composure. She could feel the eyes on her, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if it was the kind of attention she wanted. The attention wasn't filled with admiration or curiosity about her. It was filled with judgment, pity, and even a touch of disapproval. She could hear a few more voices rising in support of the royal guard. "Respect the tradition," a man called out, his voice gentle but firm. "It's his job to stand there, not to be your personal photographer." Karen turned sharply to face him, her hands now tightly clenched at her sides. She wanted to respond, to argue back, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. How had it come to this? She had been the one trying to get the attention, to get her way. But now she felt like the outsider, the one who didn't belong. The crowd had started to turn, and it was clear that the guard's dedication and calmness had won them over. For a brief moment, Karen considered walking away, but the idea of leaving without getting what she wanted, without making her point, felt unbearable. She couldn't let it go like this. Her pride was too strong, and the thought of letting the guard stand there, unaffected by her anger, was frustrating. It wasn't just about the picture anymore. It was about showing that she wouldn't let anyone get away with ignoring her. But as she looked around at the crowd, she began to realize that there was no one left to impress. The people who had been watching her now saw the situation for what it was: a woman who was trying to make a scene, and a young man who was simply doing his job with dignity. The more Karen thought about it, the more she felt small, exposed. She had wanted to be in control, but instead, she had handed control over to the royal guard, who remained steady and unwavering. The crowd was starting to rally around the guard, and the murmurs of support only grew louder. "He's a professional. He's not here for people's entertainment," someone said, shaking their head at Karen's persistence. Karen's heart sank as she heard these words. The crowd was no longer a passive bystander. They had become a force against her, silently but firmly supporting the guard's role and the importance of tradition. It was clear to everyone watching that Karen's behavior wasn't just rude, it was out of place. The royal guard had done nothing to provoke her, nothing to deserve the harsh words she had thrown at him. In fact, his quiet professionalism was exactly what had earned him the respect of the people around him. Karen's efforts to draw attention to herself had only resulted in drawing attention to her own out-of-touch attitude. As the crowd continued to side with the guard, Karen felt herself shrinking under their gaze. She had expected to walk away victorious, but instead, she was the one who felt exposed. The weight of her actions, the way she had tried to force her will on others, was becoming too much to bear. But still, she stood there, unwilling to give in completely, even as the crowd's support for the guard grew stronger. The longer Karen stood there, the more defeated she began to feel. The crowd's growing support for the royal guard was like a weight on her shoulders, and every passing second seemed to add more pressure. She had thought that with her loud demands, the guard would finally respond to her, but instead, she had become the center of unwanted attention. Her pride was wounded, and no matter how hard she tried to hold her ground, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing. Karen glanced around at the people who had once seemed like potential allies. Now their eyes were not filled with sympathy or curiosity about her, but with silent judgment. She could hear some people quietly discussing her actions, some even shaking their heads at her behavior. One elderly woman who had been standing nearby said, "She doesn't understand, does she? The guard's not here to cater to people like her." That simple comment hit Karen hard. She had spent so much of her life demanding attention, assuming people would give her what she wanted just because she asked for it. But here, in this moment, with the royal guard standing his ground, she was learning a lesson she had never expected. The world didn't revolve around her. The guard wasn't there to entertain her, nor was he there to take orders from her. He had a job to do, and no matter how much she tried to disrupt his calm, he wasn't going to budge. Karen could feel the air around her grow thicker with every passing moment. The more she tried to push, the more the guard's stoic silence worked against her. She wanted to make him break, to make him react, but he was unshakable. His stillness, his dedication to his role, made her seem all the more out of place. The crowd, who had been silent observers before, were now subtly taking his side, their attention shifting more and more away from her. The whispers and quiet murmurs in the crowd became more noticeable. Some tourists were nodding in agreement with the comments they were hearing. One woman quietly commented, "She's really making a fool of herself." Karen clenched her fists in frustration, her nails digging into her palms. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had always been the one in control, the one who could get people to do what she wanted. But now, for the first time in her life, she was the one being ignored, the one being judged. The guard's calm, unwavering demeanor had turned the entire situation around. It was as if he had become the symbol of everything she was not: steadfast, focused, and committed to something bigger than herself. She tried to gather her thoughts, thinking that maybe she could salvage the situation by walking away with some dignity, but her pride wouldn't let her. Instead, she took another step forward, her voice shaking but still determined. "You can't just stand there and ignore me forever. Someone should be doing something about this," she said, hoping to regain control over the situation. But once again, the guard stood silently, not acknowledging her words. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead, as if she had ceased to exist in his world. The more she tried to push, the more his silence became deafening, drowning out her voice. The crowd, who had once seemed like an audience to her show, was now more like a reflection of her own inability to control the situation. The people around her were beginning to exchange knowing glances. A few of them even seemed to be smiling at the scene, though they tried to hide it behind polite expressions. It was as if they had all silently agreed that Karen was in the wrong. Their support for the guard was clear now, and Karen couldn't help but feel more and more isolated in her own frustration. She realized, in that moment, that no matter how much she shouted, no matter how loudly she demanded attention, she was never going to get it from the guard. And more importantly, she was never going to get it from the crowd either. Her demands were falling on deaf ears, and the longer she stood there, the more foolish she felt. The guard's silent professionalism had made her look like the one who was out of place, and that realization stung deeper than anything else. The longer Karen stood there, the more she could feel her frustration growing. Her patience was completely gone, and all she could do now was hope for some kind of reaction, some kind of acknowledgement from the royal guard. But no matter how hard she tried to make her presence known, he continued to stand tall, his gaze fixed forward, completely unmoved by her outbursts. It was as if he couldn't even hear her. Karen felt like she was trapped in a strange dream where nothing was going according to her plan. It was supposed to be a simple situation, a few words, a request for a picture, and she would have moved on. Instead, it had turned into a public spectacle, and the more she tried to take control of it, the more out of place she felt. The crowd that had gathered around her wasn't on her side. In fact, it seemed like they were growing increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior. A few people were even starting to smile, not at her, but at the royal guard, admiring his poise and dedication. She tried to collect herself. Deep breaths, Karen, she thought. She couldn't let herself get completely embarrassed. But every time she glanced around at the crowd, she saw that they weren't looking at her the way she wanted. They weren't impressed. They weren't sympathizing with her. Instead, they were observing the scene, some of them even whispering to each other. And more of them seemed to be on the guard's side. "I've never seen someone so dedicated to their job," one man said, his voice barely audible over the light chatter of the crowd. "He's not giving in to her. That's impressive." Karen's jaw tightened at those words. Impressive. What did they mean by that? She had been the one trying to get their attention, the one who wanted something from this whole situation. But now she was the one left looking like the one who didn't understand what was going on. The royal guard's unshakable professionalism was beginning to turn the tables on her. His calmness made her seem erratic and unreasonable. Every time she raised her voice, every time she made a demand, it only made her look worse in the eyes of the people around her. They were no longer focusing on her. The attention had shifted, and now they were admiring the guard for his ability to stay composed and carry out his duties without being distracted by someone like her. Karen didn't know what to do. She couldn't believe how quickly things had escalated. She had tried to force a reaction from the guard, and now she was stuck in a situation where no matter what she said or did, she was only digging herself deeper. The more she tried to speak, the more she realized that her words were falling on deaf ears. The crowd was no longer interested in her. They were watching the guard, who was doing his job flawlessly. She turned her attention back to him. Was it really that hard for him to just break his silence and give her the attention she wanted? Couldn't he just say something, anything, that would acknowledge her presence? But again, the guard didn't budge. He didn't give in to her demands or her frustration. He was simply there, standing tall, doing his job without showing a hint of impatience. Karen felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The power she thought she had was slipping away. She was used to getting what she wanted, used to people bending to her will, but now it felt like everything was out of her control. The more she fought to be seen, the less she was noticed. The attention was on the guard, and the crowd was beginning to look at her with growing disapproval. For the first time, Karen found herself questioning her own actions. She had never felt this powerless before. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her outbursts were only making her look foolish. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, not with sympathy, but with judgment. And it was that judgment that stung the most. How had she gone from being the center of attention to becoming the object of ridicule? The longer Karen stood there, the more defeated she felt. It wasn't about the picture anymore. It wasn't even about the guard. It was about her own pride. She had tried so hard to force the situation to go her way, but now she could see that she was only making herself look ridiculous. Her need for validation had clouded her judgment, and it was starting to feel like the only thing left for her to do was to walk away. As Karen stood there, the crowd's whispers and murmurs seemed to grow louder, like a wave crashing around her. She felt herself standing at the center of a storm she had created, but now it was no longer something she could control. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. She had come here with a simple request, but now she felt like she was drowning in the consequences of her own actions. The royal guard, unmoved by her demands, stood tall and still as ever, and the crowd's growing support for him made it clear that there was no turning back. She could feel her cheeks flush with embarrassment, and her frustration deepened. Her usual way of getting people to notice her, to give her what she wanted, wasn't working. She had always been able to bend situations to her will, to get people to see things her way. But now it felt like the world was against her, and she was powerless to change it. With every passing second, Karen's grip on the situation slipped further. The crowd was no longer looking at her with curiosity or sympathy. Their eyes were on the royal guard, who had remained composed and professional throughout the entire ordeal. They admired his dedication, his ability to stand firm despite her repeated attempts to draw attention to herself. And the more they admired him, the more Karen felt her sense of control slipping away. For the first time, she began to feel something unfamiliar: humility. It wasn't a feeling she was used to, and it made her uncomfortable. Karen had always prided herself on being the one in charge, the one who could influence any situation. But now, in front of a crowd that was clearly on the side of the guard, she felt small. She had lost the battle, and she knew it. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, a way to salvage some of her dignity. She considered walking away, but the thought felt like giving up. Her pride, though battered, was still too strong for her to just walk off and leave the scene behind. She wanted to leave with something, anything, that would make her feel like she hadn't been completely defeated. As she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, Karen glanced at the royal guard once more. He remained unmoved, silent, his eyes fixed on his duty. It was clear that he wasn't interested in her outbursts or her demands. He had a job to do, and nothing was going to distract him from it. Karen could feel the weight of the moment settle in. She had spent so much time trying to force him into reacting, but he had shown her something she hadn't expected: patience. The crowd had shifted too. They weren't just watching anymore. They were supporting the guard. They had recognized his professionalism, his calm, and his respect for the tradition he was sworn to uphold. Karen's behavior, on the other hand, had made her seem entitled and out of touch. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, not with the admiration she had hoped for, but with pity and judgment. Finally, Karen realized that she had no choice but to walk away. She couldn't stand there any longer, trying to push against the tide of public opinion. The reality of the situation was clear. She had lost. She had tried to make a scene, to force a reaction, but the guard had won, not by fighting back, but by simply remaining calm and steadfast. With her head low, Karen took one last look at the royal guard, still standing tall, and then turned and walked away. The whispers of the crowd followed her, but she didn't look back. She had learned a hard lesson that day, one she would never forget. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try to control a situation, the outcome isn't in your hands. The royal guard had reminded her of that truth, and though it stung, it was a lesson she needed to learn. As Karen disappeared into the crowd, the royal guard remained in his place, undisturbed, his duty still unchanged. The crowd slowly began to disperse, and the square returned to its peaceful state. What had been a tense moment of confrontation had ended quietly, with the respect for tradition and professionalism winning the day.